really excited to have you over here. I've been waiting to do this for a really long time because of just how fascinating I found your work to be. And there's a lot to talk about because I don't completely agree with it, and I don't think that anyone can completely agree with anything, but it's extremely fascinating. So to give the audience an introduction, for those of who don't know, you are Professor Sheldon Solomon. You're a professor at the Skidmore College, and you've been one of the founders of the terror management theory. So, and you've been one of my inspirations as well. One of the figures who really, took me into psychology, especially social psychology. So, before we get into the details, I want you to just give me an overview of what terror management theory is and what you propound in this book, The Worm at the Core, which is an extremely fascinating book. So I just want you to give the audience an overview of what it is so that they know what we're talking about.
Very good. I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted that you have the character to want to exchange ideas that you don't necessarily agree with. I can't think of anything more right-minded. Moreover, I've been watching some of your interviews, and I find your work to be interesting and informative and engaging. And so I just want to say before we even get started that I think that this is a tremendously important way to get important ideas in circulation. So I'm going to, so I just think this is great. And so what really, I say to
that really means a lot to me, Professor Solomon, coming from you. And it's really taken me by surprise that, you would even bother to watch my interviews. It's really means a lot to me.
Yeah, no, this is really important because you're young and you're smart and you're excited about these ideas. And I tell the students who I teach that, yeah, we're old timers and we write papers. And if you're having trouble falling asleep, I'll send you some of them to read. But I think this is the best way to get important ideas in circulation, not to make any of us rich or famous, but rather just to get important ideas out there. All right, so with that in mind, what we call terror management theory is based on the work of a cultural anthropologist, a guy named Ernest Becker, who in the 1970s wrote some books that we stumbled onto in the early 1980s that got us moving in this direction. In a book called The Birth and Death of Meaning, Becker says in the first paragraph, I want to understand from an interdisciplinary perspective why people do what they do when they do it. And I saw that and I'm like, yeah, me too, dude. I was so refreshed by just a straightforward statement. Let's figure out why people do stuff. Moreover, Becker insisted that this was not just for the sake of knowledge, but rather he took seriously the Enlightenment view that if we really understood what it is that underlies our behavior, we might be in a position to effect constructive changes. All right, then right next to that book was The Denial of Death, for which he won a Pulitzer Prize, I believe in 1974. And in the first paragraph of that book, he says that he thinks the uniquely human awareness of death and our unwillingness or inability to accept the reality of the human condition is responsible for a considerable proportion of human behavior, whether we're aware of it or not, and mostly we're not. And so Becker goes on and he says, okay, what is it that helps us explain human behavior? And very simply, he's like, look, we're not much different than other creatures. We have a biological predisposition to persist over time. On the other hand, we're uniquely different by virtue of a configuration of sophisticated cognitive abilities that, among other things, enable us to imagine things that don't yet exist and then to make those things real. And like, that's just spectacular. And amongst that suite of abilities that render us uniquely different than other creatures is the capacity for explicit self-awareness or self-consciousness. And here Becker's borrowing from the philosopher Kierkegaard, who pointed out that we're so smart that we realize that we exist. And while that realization can be tremendously uplifting, I always like to stop and say, let's not lose track of how great it is to be alive and to know it. Kierkegaard called it awe and dread. It's awesome to be alive and to know it, but it's dreadful to be alive and to know it. Unless you're a baby or an idiot, if you know that you're here, you also know that at some moment in time, your life is of finite duration. And like all living creatures, you too will die. Well, that's a psychological knee in the groin, but then you get punched in the face when right next to that, you realize that not only are you going to die, but you can die at any time for reasons that you can't anticipate or control. Right? And those are from Kierkegaard. And then Becker, just to really knee us in the groin, he adds the Freud point that we chafe at the idea that we're embodied animals, breathing pieces of defecating meat that aren't any more significant than fruit flies or ferrets. And Becker's point is that if that's all you thought about, I'm going to die, I can walk outside and get hit by a meteor or killed by a virus, I'm a breathing piece of meat, that you wouldn't be able to stand up in the morning. You'd be completely debilitated with existential terror. What he argues is that we manage that terror by embracing what he calls cultural worldviews, beliefs about reality that we share with other people in our group that give us a sense that life has meaning and that we have value. I'd almost done. He then says, if you are fortunate enough to believe that you're a person of value in a world of meaning, that's what he calls self-esteem. And he argues that self-esteem is the primary psychological means by which culture helps us come to terms with our mortality, in part by reducing anxiety in this life, also in part by giving us hope for immortality of some sort in the next, either literally in the form of the lives, afterlives, and heavens and souls that are promised in all of the world's great religions, or symbolically, as the ancient Greeks pointed out. You may know you're not going to be here forever, but you're comforted by the prospect that some vestige of your existence will remain nonetheless, maybe from having kids, from making a lot of money, from doing something great that gets remembered over time. And so in essence, what Becker says is that we are motivated at all times to maintain confidence in our culturally constructed beliefs, as well as faith in our value in the context of them, in order to minimize death anxiety. And because of that, when existential anxieties are aroused, again, whether we're aware of it or not, we will behave in ways, attitudinally or behaviorally, to bolster confidence in our worldviews, as well as to augment our self-esteem. All right, well, one more sentence, and then I promise you I will stop. Becker won a Pulitzer Prize for his work, but really couldn't even get a job as an academic. He was dismissed on the grounds that there's no evidence for these ideas, and that there's no way that one could collect evidence. And so here's where we come in. Jeff Greenberg, Tom Pyszczynski, and myself, we were young PhDs in experimental social psychology. We read Becker's books. We found them compelling. And so terror management theory is our way of expressing Becker's ideas in theoretical terms so that we could generate hypotheses from them that could then be subjected to empirical scrutiny. That was long-winded, but that's a summary of terror management theory and its foundation from Becker's work.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it. It's a very good summary. I think that even though Becker did not get the sort of academic approval that he strove for, he did get the public approval, because even, the book got very popular. It was one of the most popular books in the counterculture, appeared in, featured in Annie Hall with the Woody Allen.
That's right.
So he did get, I think that if Becker would have written that book just a bit earlier, like during Freud's time, maybe he would have got the academic approval as well, because that's the time when psychoanalytic theory was coming up. And he wrote the book, I think, when behaviorism was just gaining ground. And so the idea of scientific method in psychology, primarily, psychoanalysis was being seen as the pseudoscientific, continues to seen by many as the pseudoscientific theory. So my first question would be, why should contemplating death lead human beings to terror or anxiety instead of, say, having more sympathy with those close to them? Because your central argument is that the moment we contemplate death, we tend to sort of close off, we become more culturally, we pride our, we give more importance to our culture, we give more harsher punishment, we become more moralistic, more tribal. But why shouldn't the contemplation of death lead to more sympathy? Because after all, we're all in the same sort of existential mode. So
yeah, no, that's an awesome question, almost like the most broad and awesome question one can pose. And our response to that is it can go either way. What we propose is that when existential anxieties are aroused, we defend ourselves by bolstering our worldviews and by trying to fortify self-esteem. And so let's do the bad first, and then we can get around to the more pro-social end of things. See, Becker and Tom and Jeff and I, when we first formulated terror management theory, it really was devoted to understanding humankind's most unsavory characteristics. And so Becker was interested in how come we can't get along with people who don't share our beliefs. He was also very much interested in the allure of charismatic populist leaders. How could somebody like Hitler have actually gotten elected? He was similarly interested in our preoccupation with money and stuff, and our inability to step back and to adequately to care for the natural environment. All right, so our early wave of studies, the first 20 or 30 years, in fact, were designed to address those issues. All right, so for example, his account of prejudice is that if my beliefs about reality serve to reduce death anxiety, then the mere existence of somebody different is problematic, because if I accept their beliefs, then I undermine the confidence with which I subscribe to my own. And that's one of the reasons he insists when we run into people who are different, we denigrate them, we try to coerce them into adopting our beliefs. If that doesn't work, we just kill them. And sure enough, we do experiments where we remind people that they're going to die. We ask them just, how do you feel about dying? Or we interview them in front of a funeral parlor, or we bring them into the lab and we flash the word death so fast that you can't even see it. And when we do that, we find consistently that you like people in your group more and you hate anybody that's different. Moreover, you sit further away from people who look different. You sit closer to people who look similar. If you're given an opportunity to hurt or harm somebody who's different, you'll do that. All right, so moving on, what Becker also said is that when existential anxieties are aroused, that's when we're likely to become attracted to charismatic leaders. That's a term from Max Weber, the German sociologist, who said, when the psychological shit hits the fan, that's when we embrace seemingly larger than life leaders who claim that God has chosen them to rid the world of evil. That's precisely what Hitler did. And we noticed in 1980 that President George W. Bush, his popularity went from the lowest to the highest in the history of American polling in 3 weeks after September 11th, 2001. And then President Bush, he said at the time, we will rid the world of evil, and that he thought God had chosen him to lead the world. Well, sure enough, we did a bunch of studies where we showed that Americans didn't care for President Bush in a control condition. But if you reminded them they were going to die, they liked him a lot more. I fast forward to 2016. Donald Trump, I call him Orange Hitler. He ran for president saying, only I can keep you safe. Right? Same thing. Our respondents liked Hillary Clinton more than Trump in a control condition. When death was on their mind, they like Trump more. Right? When we remind people that they're going to die, they deny that humans are animals, and they more readily exploit the natural environment. People that are reminded that they're going to die, they just become more desperate and eager shoppers. They want more money. They want more stuff. When we remind people that they're going to die, it amplifies all existing forms of psychological disorders. And so Becker starts his last book called Escape from Evil with a quote from this Thomas Hardy dude: if a way to the better there be, it comes from taking a close look at the worst. And what I just did in the last 5 minutes sure sounds pretty bad. In other words, these malignant manifestations of death anxiety, turn us into these demoralized, hateful, warmongering proto-fascists plundering the planet in an alcohol Facebook stupor. And Becker wonders at the end of his last book, are we a viable form of life? After all, we haven't been here that long, and it's an open issue as to whether or not self-conscious pieces of species meat is a good idea from an evolutionary perspective. But let's turn that around, though, and let's note three things that are important. One is that that what these death reminders do depend on the worldview that you possess in the first place. So, for example, in the United States, we usually divide people, well, this is probably true everywhere at this point, into liberals versus conservatives. And the word liberal, if you look it up in the dictionary, means tolerant and open-minded. Whereas conservatives, and I don't mean this as a pejorative statement, but conservatives will admit to not being particularly tolerant of those who are different. Well, sure enough, we've done experiments where when we remind conservative participants they're going to die, they hate people who are different. But when we remind liberal participants they're going to die, they actually like people who are different more. So that's one thing, that depending on the worldview that you embrace in the first place, that affects the outcomes of arousing existential anxieties. Thing number two is that when death is on our minds, we do care much more about some things, particularly things that are of personal and social value. We do care more about our family, and we do care more about the people who we identify as members of our tribe. And so experiments show that death reminders increase altruism, but only to in-group members, right? The last point, and I think this is the most profoundly important one, is that when we tell people at the beginning of our experiments that human beings have a lot more in common than we are different, we call this a common humanity prime. This was done by my buddy Tom Pyszczynski and his students. And this has the virtue of actually being true, because every human being on Earth is descended from a relatively small pile of humans in a single neighborhood in Africa. We are an incredibly homogeneous species. But the point is when we remind people of that, and then we subsequently remind them of death, they no longer hate people who are different, because we've just defined everybody in the human family as members of our tribe. So I like evolutionary theorists who, when they step back these days and they're like, wow, we are in bad shape if we can't come up with a way to manage these festering ethnic conflicts that at any point, can render the earth into a smoldering heap unfit for human habitation, that the real key may be to get the human animal to reconceive of itself as a member of one large interdependent family, which may sound naive, but as I said earlier, it's A, true, and B, psychodynamically, perhaps the only way that we could get the best out of humans as transient creatures.
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but one of the things that which came to my mind as we were talking is the idea of disgust sensitivity. And I'm wondering how much of the hatred of people outside their one's group has to do with disgust sensitivity versus death anxiety. Because we know that from the big five personality model that people who are more conservative are more likely to be. Look at the voluntary disgust sensitivity model. That's how the propagandas of, Hitler, for instance, referred to Jews as parasites. He was disgusted by them. So, so how do you separate death anxiety from disgust sensitivity, and how do you know that one over next year?
No, they're inextricably connected. What we know is that, and we know this empirically, we know that when people are shown things that disgust them, and we measure what's called implicit death thought accessibility, English translation, this is how much is death on your mind, but you don't know it. And we do this primarily with a little word stem completion task. It'd be like, oh, here's some letters, make a word into this. So it'd be COFF blank blank. And people that have just passed a Starbucks earlier in the day, even if they don't remember, they're more apt to say coffin, or coffee rather, forgive me. If you pass the cemetery, you're more apt to say coffin. Well, the point is that we've done studies, and if you show people things that disgust them, that brings unconscious death thoughts more readily to mind. And if we remind people that they're going to die, that makes things more disgusting. And so, yes, there is an inextricable connection between disgust sensitivity and death anxiety. And that's because the evolutionary argument with regard to the origin of disgust is that it's a reflexive biological reaction to that which could kill us. So it shouldn't surprise us that the most existentially threatening things are associated with that which might kill us. Yes.
So I think that we need to separate death versus death anxiety, because I think that the terror management theory applies broadly only to human beings. So death is essentially every creature attempts to avoid death. It is
Yeah.
more at the movement, when someone tries to kill a cockroach or something, it tries to run away. So every creature sort of has this, innate need to avoid death to survive.
Yeah.
Death anxiety is the recognition of one's own mortality. It is only human beings who can, understand that one day we are going to die, and that seems to be not present in most animals, or at least it's not yet been observable. So, what is really interesting to me is that the terror management theory posits that all of these social institutions and religion and politics and the system evolved as a sort of to avoid sort of death anxiety, not to put it behind us. But there's also a social contract theory, which is to that I think that there's a sociological element to it as well as a psychological element to it. What terror management theory does is only talks about the psychological element. And the reason it matters is because these institutions don't just save us from death anxiety, they actually keep us away from death itself, right? So do you see this as a contradiction in your theory? Because if we are in a room and someone tries to, a person tries to take out a knife, attempts to be a psychopath logically, then everything is going to be chaotic. There's a social contract in the room that I'm going to sit there and your role is to teach and my role is to sit down. But the moment a person ducks away from that social contract, everything breaks down. There's chaos. And what happens at that moment is you're not attempting to avoid death anxiety as much as you're attempting to avoid death itself, harm to yourself. So, can you elaborate a bit on this? And what do you think is the role of social mediation, so social contract, in terror management theory? Is it recognized or is it completely out of the picture?
Wow. No, these are awesome and important, and I believe exceptionally valid observations. So my first day in graduate school, I walked into the room, and on one side was a quote by a famous psychologist, Kurt Lewin or Levine, and there's nothing more useful than a good theory. On the other side was a quote from a German physicist, I can't remember what his name was, and it said, all theories are wrong. And the people who taught us were really careful, and they're like, don't get too enamored with your own ideas. And so back to your question, or rather just your observation, which is that terror management theory seems too narrowly focused on what turns out to be ultimately a psychological claim, and that is that every human pursuit is singularly the result of efforts to transcend death. And it sure sounds like that if you read our stuff. And I would submit that that's unfortunate, and probably due to some of our youthful enthusiasm at the time, and also probably due to our naivete. And this is to our discredit, because as social psychologists, we never really stood back and thought about this in terms of institutional structures. And it's only been later, over the decades, when we've realized, and we've not yet repaired what I believe to be deficiencies in our way of thinking about things. To put this another way, when I talk about our ideas these days, the point that I would like to make is that everything that we talk about, culture, religion, politics, they are surely multidimensional in their function, and surely highly adaptive, in the sense that, the reason that we're alive today is that we're uber social creatures who exist in a cultural context that accumulates over time. And that, that's why we can fly to the moon, and you and I are talking to each other across the globe and stuff like that. And it would be ludicrous, as I think you've intimated, to argue that all of these things are merely in the service of diminishing existential anxieties. And there's nothing in terror management theory that illuminates how those institutions are constructed and how they operate. What terror management theory and what Ernest Becker could comfortably assert, however, is there is no human affair that isn't potentially influenced by existential anxieties. So when I write about evolutionary matters these days, I point out that religion almost surely evolved long before there was any awareness of death, that culture surely evolved as an extraordinary way for humans to not only adapt, but to prosper and thrive. And so, yeah, I guess in my long-winded way, I applaud the point that you're making. And if I wasn't on the threshold of senility, that's what I would want to be doing over the next few years, is to do a better job of positioning terror management theory in other discourses that I believe address those concerns more broadly and more thoroughly. And so I'm thinking here of two things. One is work by Joseph Henrich, and he's an anthropologist who writes about cultural evolution. And then the other is by a developmental psychologist, a gentleman named Michael Tomasello, who wrote a book called Becoming Human. And I think that, so what we get from Henrich is a model of cultural evolution, making it quite clear how we are uniquely adapted to be cultural learners and cultural creatures. Then we've got Michael Tomasello talking about what is required for us to be able to function in that fashion. And he talks about joint attention, the cognitive keto that allows human beings to have independent minds while at the same time collaborating both dyadically and across time and space. And that's the way that we get accumulated cultural knowledge. And what Tomasello says is that those cognitive capabilities are evolutionary extrapolations and elongations of primate attachment. Well, so's terror management theory. And my point is that I see for the youth, like you're looking pretty young and like you got a few decades of extraordinary opportunity to think about these things. I really do think the time is ripe. I don't think that, quote, terror management theory is wrong when it claims that existential anxieties pervade the human condition, but it would make a mockery, I think, of reality if we didn't step back and say that it is one critical aspect, but surely not a sole explanation for anything.
Well, that's interesting, because I think every theory, starts out incomplete. So it's up to the duty of the future generations to sort of give us a complete picture. And it's true for the terror management theory as well, because it's relatively recent, relatively new. Social psychology itself is relatively new. So, uh, so one of the another question that I had, and this is a very common and simple question, which is that why doesn't the fear of death um, lead to nihilism? Why do anything at all? Why build things? Why not just sit back and you know, not do anything?
Yeah, well, I think for a clump of humanity, that's precisely what happens. And, here I like Heidegger's take. I've just become recently familiar with his ideas in Being and Time. And he makes some points that I was thinking about when you mentioned earlier that, we need to distinguish between death and death anxiety. And Heidegger's take is, yeah, absolutely. And his point is everything alive perishes, but only humans die. And that's because his definition of death requires the explicit awareness of its inevitability. And Heidegger calls that angst, which is typically translated as anxiety, but evidently has broader connotations, including anxiety, but beyond it, that just feeling of a sense of uncanniness and of being unsettled and psychologically dispossessed, not being at home. And Heidegger's point is that's the awareness of death impinging upon you. And he's like, look, some people are literally, they're incapable. They lack the existential maturity, the courage, or the circumstances that permit them to have a sincere engagement with the reality of the human condition. And so in his mind, he calls it a flight from death. He just says that these folks, they take psychological refuge in their social roles. And they literally become culturally constructed meat puppets. He borrows a phrase from Kierkegaard here. He says they get tranquilized by the trivial. And that could be, but for Heidegger, that could go in one of two directions. You could become a caricature of a stereotype of your social roles. So you could be like, oh, I'm a banker. I'm going to be the best banker in the world, or I'm gonna become a soccer football fan, and I'm going to devote my life to how well my team is doing. So that would be one way, just a kind of frenetic embracing of a social role. But the other way is just the kind of nihilistic, why do anything, which is basically the average American, spending their time hanging in the house, downing a 12-pack of beer, spraying Cheese Whiz on a cracker, watching another 12 hours of television. So, Becker just said the average person spends most of their time shopping or drinking, which is the same thing. And so nihilism is one way. And in the midst of the pandemic, my sense is there's been no shortage of movement in that direction. On the other hand, it need not go that way. And so here are the possibilities for a more benevolent and constructive confrontation with one's mortality. And so then Heidegger says, yeah, but we can do better than that. And I like his description of the process, because he says that what angst does, it literally momentarily blows away your culturally constructed universe and your identity within it. And his point is that anxiety it's unpleasant, but it can also be beneficial, that it's yourself metaphorically calling yourself to find yourself. In other words, to dispose of an anxiety laden social identity, and to discover in the aftermath of that who and what you are in a more conscious and mature fashion. And for Heidegger, that requires that you do two things. One is that you accept the inevitability of your death, not as something that will happen in a vaguely unspecified future moment, but something that can happen right now, like a meteor can come through my window and knock my head off now. That's different than I will die someday. And then on top of that, Heidegger talks about we have to accept what the existentialists call guilt, which is an awkward term because it has nothing to do with moral transgression. It has to do with realizing that even though you're a contingent entity born in a time and place not of your choosing, and that dramatically limits the choices that you have to make, that, excuse me, that you're nevertheless still responsible for the choices that you make, including ones that are undoubtedly from time to time bad, resulting in what the poet Maria Rilke called the guilt of unlived life. So anyway, Heidegger says if you could do that, then you can get on the other side of this existential conundrum, and that your life will be qualitatively different as a result. He literally talks about how you're anticipatory, you're looking forward, you're resolute, you're devoted to the things that matter to you, you're solicitous, you care about the people around you. And then he says life at its best feels like an ongoing journey that is completely suffused with unshakable joy. And he's not a simpleton. He's not saying that everything's great, anxiety's gone, suffering is eliminated. He's just pointing out the existential point, which is that the fullest appreciation of life requires the capacity to experience it in its totality. And that means the misery as well as the joy.
So, well, that's just one of the reasons I find your work to be fascinating is your interest and your interest in philosophy and the way you incorporate philosophical and psychological principles into the terror management theory. It's fascinating, interdisciplinary, and something that we rarely see, because one of the things that has happened until recently is psychologists or the so-called scientists moving away from philosophy and declaring that philosophy is dead. But your work is steeped in philosophy. Your work is essentially attempting to answer a philosophical question through a scientific lens, and that is extremely rare and extremely fascinating. So I just wanted to say that. But
no, thank you. Not surprisingly, I agree. And one of the things that troubles me in North America is that there are excellent schools and the psychology departments are changing their names. So there's some very good schools, I believe, like at Dartmouth University, there's no psychology department. It's the Department of Brain and Behavioral Sciences. Now, I in no way want to intimate that it is unimportant to understand the neuroanatomical foundation of all aspects of human affairs, but I find that unfortunate in that it is defining a lot of what I believe to be interesting and important questions. It's defining them out of relevance for psychological discourse. So I hope that that what we've tried to do, we're not suggesting that this should be the only way that one approaches work in the psychological sciences, but we do think that it is useful to proceed in this direction. And we feel that there is progress in this domain. So, for example, there's now in psychological science a branch called experimental existential psychology. And I think this is very good that that experimentalists are taking seriously the notion that existential questions can be investigated with using empirical methods. However, I don't want us to get to the point where we begin to either implicitly or explicitly arrogantly assume that the only ideas worth considering are ones that are the result of an empirical process, because that radically lobotomizes the wide range of ideas and disciplines that I think are invaluable when it comes time to enhance our understanding of the human entity.
So it really doesn't make any sense to see psychology as this pure, disinterested field when you're talking about human beings, and human beings are very complex and very malleable, and you cannot just reduce them to this one scientific thing. If you want to study them, you need to study the art that they produce, you need to study the literature that they produce, the ideas, the philosophy, and to just completely discard that is to discard a very important and inextricable part of human beings, the symbolic meaning thing.
Well said.
So, well, speaking of symbolic meaning, the terror management theory conceptualizes symbolic meaning as having come from a sort of need to immortalize, keep a legacy of yourself. But I think that the alternative view to that is that it's a byproduct, which is to say that we know that reason evolved, reason has a rationality, and reason has evolutionary benefits, developed as an evolutionary adaptations, as Steven Pinker calls this the open-ended combinatorial reasoning system. So according to him, I think this is proved by Louis Levenberg's experiment. He went to the indigenous San people who were hunter-gatherers, and what he found was that they were using reason to determine which the animal's sex, or on what year they breed or what area they live in, and if there is any disagreement, then if you present evidence, the majority view changes. So they use a form of deductive reasoning. So reason is sort of innate to us, and the byproduct of reason is symbolic meaning, which seems to have evolved as a need to keep track of the memories and of the things that you're hunting and stuff in a hunter-gatherer society. And the byproduct of that further ahead is religion. So I think that it's quite plausible that symbolic meaning, that death, the representation of death through symbolic meaning, is a secondary product rather than an evolutionary adaptation. What do you make of that?
Yeah, this is awesome. Who knows? So basically, again, with all due respect, I think Pinker emphasizes the rational, and it doesn't even take the time, frankly, to consider the non-rational death denying. Now, we're guilty of the opposite. And I think a more rounded view, I like Daniel Kahneman. Do you know his work on slow and fast?
Thinking fast and slow.
Yeah. So my point, and by the way, one of the best days of my life was sitting next to him. We were getting an award. He got a big plaque, rightfully so, and we got a tiny one. But the point is that his ideas, there's a lot of dualistic systems that are very similar. And Kahneman's point is, yeah, we're totally capable of reasoning, but that's not our default cognitive apparatus. That takes time, takes effort, takes motivation, takes attention, takes practice and pedagogy. The default state is the non-rational. I didn't say irrational, but that's the more narratively driven, symbolic, non-analytic, where you just heuristically attend to the culturally constructed schema without any active deliberation. And in fact, we've demonstrated in our work that the effects that we get in our studies when we remind people that they're going to die, they only occur when you're not in a rational mindset. And so definitely rationality, very cool, very obviously pervades the human enterprise. But Aristotle and Pinker and anybody else who says that that's the way that we typically engage with life, I respectfully disagree. We can occasionally lapse into reason, but it certainly doesn't happen all that often, I would submit, or we wouldn't be watching billionaires fly to the moon while the world is literally on fire and in need of vaccines to treat the pandemic. In other words, I can't see how a rational animal would be behaving in any way that's remotely approximate to what I see around me. But getting back to your other point, there's disagreement, and I don't have the knowledge to weigh in authoritatively. There are people who talk about symbols as an extension of reason. I can't remember his name. He's in New Zealand. Robert Boyd maybe wrote a book called The Origin of Stories. Another guy, Stephen Mithin, The Prehistory of the Mind. They basically talk about symbols as extraordinary ways of embedding large amounts of information. That was the point that you made. And that can be true. But then Suzanne Langer, she's an American philosopher of yesteryear in the 1950s and 60s. She just said there's no more simple-minded statement that one could make than to propose that the only function of symbols is containers for information. And she introduces her view that they are affectively laden cognitive entities that surely do convey information, but that they also serve to modulate emotions in an existentially relevant way. And I don't know that yeah, I'm not sufficiently versed in those areas to know if anybody's even thought about those ideas. But I like how you're posing the questions.
I think that's a very important point, especially the point about Kahneman. I think that Kahneman, as well as Dan Ariely's work, has sort of it has some empirical proof that our default position is irrationality. I think Pinker's next book is actually on rationality. So I do sort of sympathize with that, because one of the largest institutions that we have, the all-pervasive institution, religion, I consider that, being an atheist, I consider that to be irrational. So yep. It does make sense that the irrational often overrides the rational. Human beings are flawed creatures. Speaking of religion, do you think that religion evolved? What do you think about the argument that religion evolved as a byproduct? Because I do think that the likes of Paul Bloom and Dan and Dennett have made a really strong argument in favor of it, because and it comes from our inherent sort of irrational urges, which is to say that we detect patterns when there are no patterns. We detect agents when there are no agents, which is why we see faces in clouds, but we don't see clouds in faces, right?
Yeah.
So also the idea of the theory of mind, which is a convincing explanation of how the idea of God might have started, And when we were living in evolutionary times, it's probable that we evolved because it's good for you evolutionary to see a rope and consider it to be a snake, then see a snake and consider it to be a rope. It helps with the survival. So we detect, so that the agent detection combined with the theory of mind that we attribute intentions when there are not any, so when we observe these things which we were not able to make sense of, rain and natural disasters, then we attribute intentions and agencies to them. And as a byproduct, the concept of God evolved and then religion evolved. What do you think of this explanation?
Yeah, no, I'm if my buddies Jeff and Tom were here, they would disagree. I don't have a problem with that. I think that is a good natural explanation of religious proclivities. And I see nothing inconsistent with that view, with the collateral assertion that once consciousness got to a certain point where concerns about mortality became relevant, that those affectations were co-opted for terror management purposes. In other words, the folks like the Dennetts of the world, again, these are smart people, much smarter than I, but they can't explain the findings of dozens of studies where we remind people that they're going to die, and they become more convinced in God's efficacy and the efficacy of prayer. Even atheists, when they're reminded that they're going to die, if you ask them about do they believe in God, they say, fuck no. In fact, they believe in God less after a death reminder, whereas religious people believe in God more. But if you measure belief in supernatural unconsciously, even atheists become more partial to supernatural ideation in the wake of death reminders. Similarly, when atheists in some experiments are shown, quote, well, it's fake evidence, but they're shown evidence suggesting that Jesus may have existed, that increases their unconscious death thought accessibility in the same way that if you remind a Christian fundamentalist, if you show them logical inconsistencies in the Bible, their death thought accessibility goes up. So do you know that John Gray, he's the British philosopher, he wrote a book on atheism. He has like seven different, and I like that. So with all due respect, I think even atheism is a nuanced set of multi-dimensional considerations. Some of them are no different than other death-denying worldviews, except that they're especially shallow and superficial in that they lend no insight about what is of meaning and value. That's not a blanket indictment of atheism when I would define myself in the same fashion. I forgot why we were talking about that, but I do think that's an important point.
Well, it's interesting. I think that how do you measure whether someone is thinking about it unconsciously, from an empirical perspective?
Yeah, so I'll have to send you things because this gets a little globby. It has to do with the reaction times to pairing self-relevant words with supernatural
So is
construct.
it like the implicit bias
It's an
test?
IAT, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a modification of the IAT with both the virtues and the drawbacks of that method. But I'll send you those things. It's a guy named Jonathan Jong who was, I don't know where he is right now, but it's a paper called The Atheists in the Foxhole, where he showed that even atheists are responsive to death reminders.
So as I was reading your book, I saw your explanation, you're talking about the Göbekli Tepe thing, how we were burying and having these elaborated rituals long before agriculture, which was, I think, a proof that our religious impulse is much, much older than we thought it was. But when I read about these sort of agricultural communities, because it seemed to me like the reason you bury someone is because you want them to live on after their death, because you have a belief in reincarnation.
Yeah.
But as I read about the earliest agricultural community of the Middle East, they were burying their dead in their house as a symbolic sort of proof that, this is my property. My ancestors are buried here, so this is my property. And it seems to me like that it's plausible that burial might have emerged as a symbolic reminder of private property instead of a belief in reincarnation.
Yep, fair enough. Here's again another example of us speculating. We'd never have claimed, not to sound defensive, but our strongest claims are based on the evidence that we've collected with existing humans, showing that arousing existential anxieties affects every aspect of human activity that we've studied so far. And then for the book, The Worm at the Core, we felt, as well as the editor, that it would be incumbent upon us to come up with an evolutionary account that might be plausible in light of those claims. And so when we studied the evolution of agriculture, the point that we found most convincing that doesn't require terror management theory is just the unequivocal fact that the prevailing explanation of yesteryear, which is that we started to farm when the weather got bad, that just seems completely untenable in light of the fact that we settled down 1,000 years before the advent of agriculture. So what we kept reading about was people used to say, well, the reason we went from nomadic hunter-gatherers to living in a town was to farm. But, that's just ridiculous. People wouldn't have been like, we're sick and tired of chasing our food, so let's just stay here and grow a tomato, as if that could ever have happened. And so we take seriously the folks who have no stake in terror management theory, like Ian Hodder, who wrote the paper about the Turkish place that I can't pronounce that you did. And his point is that it was a religious pursuit that made people settle down first and foremost. And once we saw that, well, then that got us to the potential death-denying aspects of religion. But you're quite right to note that there are any number of other plausible possibilities. That's right.
I think even the archaeologist who excavated the place, I've forgotten his name, even he thought that this was, a religious ritual like places, because there were elaborate sculptures, elaborate paintings, and it's possible that people in Göbekli Tepe actually had belief in the afterlife, because there's no agriculture in that place. All you can find is animal bones. Could be because of animal sacrifice. So Yeah. And I want you to talk about, because this was extremely fascinating to me and I never looked at it through that perspective. Your explanation for the existence of misogyny or patriarchal society in general, which is that uh, the rules were written by men, and because men are, we are generally afraid of our animal nature, we create it. So, can you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, this is work that was spearheaded by one of our students, now a professor, Jamie Goldenberg, and she was interested in how these ideas, might help us understand the matters pertaining to patriarchy and misogyny. And so early on, I alluded to some of that work when I said that some of the early studies were just about people reminded that they're going to die. They don't like the fact that we're animals. When we remind people that they're going to die, it makes them uncomfortable with the idea of sex as a physical activity. And so extrapolating from that, we don't like that we're animals, and that bodily activities are unpleasant when death is on our mind. Jamie's point was that women, as the entities that give birth to children and who menstruate on a monthly basis, and who after birth are lactating, they're just oozing bouillabases of corporal reality. In other words, women are an indisputable, in your face reminder of the basic bodily nature of the human condition. And the argument is that that's one of the reasons why we tend to, we being the patriarchal culture, why women are denigrated. And so that's one element. And we know that, I'm sorry about that. That's somebody, that's my dog. But, and we know from evidence that that's the case, because Jamie and her colleagues have done some remarkable studies where what people reminded that they're going to die, they sit further away from somebody who appears to be pregnant, or somebody who appears to be nursing a baby. And then what she also hypothesizes is that men also psychodynamically, they blame women for, we blame women, I'll own being a guy, for our own sexual inclinations. And so this is the very common idea that, no, I didn't rape you, you were dressing provocatively. And you don't need terror management theory for that notion, but it's a combination of all of those factors that we argue and that experiments appear to bear out, that suggest that, again, some aspects, by no means all of them, that are associated with patriarchy and misogyny are efforts of guys. So Virginia Woolf, in A Room of One's Own, she has a nice metaphor. She calls it a looking glass self, where she's like, well, what guys do is they look at women, like backwards through a magnifying glass. It's by making women look small that we make ourselves look big. So some of it's an effort to bolster our self-esteem at the expense of another group, but a lot of it, we argue, is just death denial in the form of denigrating creatures who are persistent reminders of our corporeal nature.
So I think that's a very interesting explanation for men. But one of the things that I also found out through your book was that even women, went away when they saw someone, mistakenly taking out a tampon or things like that. So why do you think? So do you think this is cultural? Do you think that?
Yeah, I do. There's like E.B. Du Bois's notion of double consciousness, or what becomes Claude Steele's notion of stereotype threat. We are the victims as well as the beneficiaries of our culture. So if you're steeped in a culture in which your social role is fundamentally inferior to begin with, as heinous as that is, when psychodynamically existential anxieties are aroused, that is likely to increase your own self-flagellation.
So what is also fascinating is the ritual aspect in animals, because rituals are not just unique to human beings. I recently read, I think it was a paper about elephants. When a member of their own tribe dies, they surround the dead elephant and they perform some sort of ritual. They mourn and they take out leaves and branches over their dead body. So why do you think that? So do you think that it is possible that animals also have a semblance of afterlife, or of their own mortality? Because I am not sure how you can explain a ritual like that.
Yeah, good point. And it would be, I think, arrogant to proclaim anything to be the unique purview of the human animal, to the extent that we want to think about things from an evolutionary vantage point. It should not trouble us to find rudimentary incarnations of what appear in more, and I'm not saying better, but in more elaborate forms in humans, in other creatures that are highly social and uber intelligent. And so, yeah, we see it in elephants. Evidently, we see it in dolphins. Crows are smarter than most of my students. And let's see if we see anything there. The one thing, though, that I do think is important to point out is that in these other creatures, and this is not an evaluative statement so much as an observation, you see them only in the presence of death itself. And it's only in humans, as far as we can tell, that children as young as 2 are aware of and concerned about death, even in situations where the possibility of one's life being threatened is remote to the point of as being close to impossible. And so, yeah, on the one hand, I'm granting continuity, while on the other hand, insisting there's still a yawning chasm. And that has to do with getting to the point where you're able to recognize our finitude at all moments in time, which I don't think is the case for these other species, as far as I can tell.
I think it's interesting. There was an experiment conducted on children where they were shown a play, and in that play, it was a puppet show, and a person dies of starvation, and they're asked questions about it, and these were 4-year-olds with no conception of reincarnation or immortality, and they have their answers were that they will continue to exist, they will not require food or things like that, but they will continue to exist even after they die, and that there will eventually be a reunion. So it seems to me that the religious impulse is very innate in us. It's very hard to deny that. We can disagree about the reasons for it, but it's very hard to deny the fact that the religious impulse is innate in us. Also, I wanted to talk about Jordan Peterson's objection to your claims, because you know him since knew him when he was writing the Maps of Meaning, I think.
Yeah.
So his objection, and he has in multiple lectures mentioned the terror management theory and Ernst Becker, and his objection is that there are ways of living that are worse than death. So it isn't obvious to him why humans would be motivated by a fear of death when there's literally hell on earth in totalitarian regimes, when death seems to be the better way out. So the fear of death to him seems to be simplistic, and he argues that it's complexity that drives human beings and not death itself.
Yeah, again, we'll agree to disagree on that one. We go way back, Jordan and I. We agree. I would submit, and I wish he was here to weigh in. I think we agree on a lot more than we disagree about. And to me, this is important, in that we agree that we're fundamentally meaning-making entities. We agree that this is a historical moment in time when a lot of people are having tremendous difficulties maintaining a sense that life has meaning. We disagree when it comes time to, what's the best way to procure that meaning. I would submit that he's more devoted to the Judeo-Christian tradition and to free market economies as the best way to pursue those uniquely human yearnings. And we would also agree that existential anxieties pervade these concerns. Right now, when Jordan says, well, it's more complicated than death anxiety, to be silly, sure. On the other hand, there's more than 1,000 studies showing that reminding people of death, not just anything negative, and by the way, death reminders have a particular neuroanatomical locus in the brain. Don't ask me what it is. I just call it brain meat. But the people that study this point out that concerns about mortality are registered in a unique place in the brain. I would say that, just like the physical world is complex, but gravity's everywhere and it brings us down, I believe that death anxiety is more pervasive and central to human affairs. And of course, things are complex, and in psychobabble, therefore, would interact with a host of other factors that need to be delineated and investigated. But we were just going to disagree on that one, perhaps. I would submit on historical grounds that when you look at what people have been doing for the last couple of tens of thousands of years, it's been a feverish effort not to die. When you look at the results of our studies, I don't see how you can explain them without looking at death anxiety as necessary, but by no means sufficient. And so that would be my view, and what I would say to Jordan if we were sitting here together. I would be like, okay, let's go at this the way that we were trained as psychological scientists. And so give me an example of something complicated that and then explain it to me. And moreover, explain why, if we remind people of death, that wouldn't have a predictable outcome based on terror management theory. And if it did, on what grounds you would then proclaim that we're being simple-minded. I don't know if that makes any sense, but And by the way, we started our conversation when I said, this is awesome that we're going to talk about things. And you said, oh, I don't agree with you. Well, I don't agree with me. This is the way that science works. And to me, this is important for anybody that's out there listening. It's science is much different than rooting for your favorite sports teams. At its best, it's having spirited conversations along these lines. And that's where most of our ideas have arisen. I think the first time I bumped into Jordan was like 30 years ago when we were both young, when I was speaking about these ideas. And he's like, dude, you're wrong. And I'm like, yeah, maybe, but let's talk about it. So my point is that these are not personal disputes so much as genuine intellectual dialogue in the service of moving things proverbially forward, which is a good thing.
Of course, dogma is not the exact antithesis of science. It would be ridiculous to be dogmatically believe in anything that would verge on religion or meaning. So you said that we're going through a crisis of meaning. Do you not think that all of these institutions that we've created are essentially created to provide us with meaning, whether it's religion or politics or any of that? And the absence of meaning would naturally entail that you would be faced with death anxiety. And it's not obvious to me that the absence of meaning results in a conscious manifestation of death anxiety.
That's right. And so this is awesome. And so really, and here's the high dollar question then, if you disrupt somebody's meaning system, our view is that should raise levels of death thought accessibility, not that you would necessarily be explicitly aware of anything. And the work that I'm familiar with seems to find that. All right. But if we had another group of folks here from where are they at in Vancouver? What do we got there? University of British Columbia. There's another group of great folks. They're the meaning making model people. And they're like, yeah, we are primarily motivated to make meaning. And it has little to do with death anxiety. That our overriding motive is that we need things to be meaningful. And death is one of an innumerable number of things that might impinge upon us that undermines meaning. So here's another area where there's spirited disagreement and where people of goodwill can have a variety of viewpoints. And again, for people that are interested, that's where you got to get into the proverbial weeds and look at the research, look at the different points of view, and yeah, come to your own conclusions, or even better, jump in and think about work that might be able to resolve those possibilities.
Why do you think people are leaving aside the evolutionary explanation? Why do you think that people care so much about what happens to them after death? Because it really makes no sense to me from a philosophical perspective.
No, it makes absolutely no sense. I love that. So, I'm with Lucretius or the Epicureans. Nobody worries about that there were millions of years before we were born. So as you know, why then should we worry about the millions of years when we won't be here after we're gone? And I think that's completely reasonable. And this gets back to the point, which is that people, most of us, are rarely reasonable. And I've spent most of my life trying to reassure myself that that's a great explanation for why this should bother me not. and I would still be willing to sign up for the wait list to extend my life in perpetuity.
So
So,
we do,
um,
even scientists have, created the longevity transhumanism and cryogenics and things like that. So it's not limited to religion.
no, there you go. So that, and no, you're awesome. And that's my kind of running dialogue with the transhumanists. They say this is just completely reasonable. And we see it as no different than people in the old days, wandering the earth looking for magical waters or the fountain of youth, that these are thinly veiled efforts to avoid dying.
So if religion evolved as a way to ward off death anxiety, that explains why we have afterlife, why we have heaven, but it doesn't really explain why we have hell and why that is such a huge part of almost all major religions, morality in hell.
No, awesome. I think, again, here's where I think it would behoove us to not rely on singular explanations for everything. So my view, and I thought of this, I don't know if I'm right, so I'm just literally I'm not making, well, no, I am, I'm speculating. When I read back in the day, Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, and he talks about the evolution of cooperation. I wonder if heaven and hell, that I wonder if they can be seen as extraordinarily effective ways to render reciprocal altruism as an ESS, an evolutionarily stable strategy. Because what Dawkins points out, based on the Axelrod work, is that that in order to maximize reciprocation, that you can't be the one to have the last move, because in any interaction where it's one off and you're never going to see the other individual again, according to game theory, you're better off defecting. It's only when you don't get the last move that you're better off cooperating. And so one of the things I've been thinking about for decades is if you want to foster pro-social altruistic behavior in large groups of, non-kin, what better way than to have somebody who knows all and sees all that can whack you if you don't do the right thing. So that's and again, I don't know, I've not bumped into that in other evolutionary accounts, but yeah, I see heaven and hell as a very effective way. God always gets the last move, and if thou does not do the right thing, you shall be smote. I think that's a pretty good way to secure cooperative behavior under those conditions.
It's also interesting to me the emergence of heterodox thoughts. For instance, there are non-theistic religions which do not emphasize on afterlife or the existence of God, and many explicitly deny the existence of God. There have been non-theistic schools of thought within the pantheon of Hinduism, for instance, who explicitly say that rituals meaningless, God doesn't exist, and it's a creation of demons and knaves and idiots, and that enjoy your life while it lasts, and that death is the ultimate end. And what I haven't been able to figure out is how have these ideas existed and tolerated within some cultures while being absolutely reviled, untouched, seen as untouchable in others. and also the idea of suicide. Some cultures celebrate suicide, other cultures, consider it to be a grave sin. So you have two conflicting worldviews, each of which have been pretty considerably influential in human beings across a long time period. And I don't have a good enough explanation from it, and especially from a terror management perspective. So I also want you to talk about, apart from this, your general, how this terror management theory approach suicide, because many people would say that's a problem for DMT.
Yeah, well, suicide is the problem for every theory of psychology. So let's be very clear, not to sound defensive, but at present, it defies explanation. Now, in the Worm at the Core book, we again try and think about it in terror management terms by presenting evidence historically, in a literary sense, and even some clinical evidence that people that kill themselves are often believe that there is something on the other side of that act that is demonstrably superior, that involves an extension of their existence over time. All right, so that would be the terror management view. So we quote Dostoevsky from The Possessed, for example, in our book, where a character kills himself, and he says before he does it is, I'm so afraid of death, I'm gonna fucking kill myself because at least then I can control my own fear. And there's a lot of stuff in Shakespeare where there are explicit connections between taking one's own life and that being the ultimate act counterintuitively of perpetuating. But that doesn't square all that well with the dominant views these days of suicide. And, there's any number of models, and yet in, some of the most prominent big reviews of the suicide literature. There's a Franklin et al., I don't remember, Psychological Bulletin article. It was a meta-analytic review about a decade ago. And they just said, suicide's one of the central issues of psychological inquiry. We've been looking at it for 100 years, and we understand almost nothing. And so it doesn't make it any less important, both clinically as well as theoretically, but we just have not made very much headway in that regard. And so, yeah, back to you on that. And right now, and I don't know this work that well, but they're looking in terms of like algorithms of neuronal activity to just try and detect subtle patterns that might allow us to predict in advance both suicidal behavior as well as suicidal ideation. But I don't think anybody's got a good handle on that just yet.
I think that psychopathology in itself is very poorly understood. We don't have much empirical ways to solve it. We don't even understand most of the psychopathological disorders that we have. So it's not just suicide per se, it's also things like psychopathy, it's things like OCD, because it's often the case that some of these disorders last for a certain time, and after that age just stops automatically. So there is no coherent explanation. We don't understand how it works. We don't understand which of them has cultural effects, which of them are biologically oriented. So it seems to me like you said, that it's a problem for all forms of psychology. So because psychology in itself is a relatively new field, relatively new science. I mean, it only started, what, 200 years ago? And do we expect it to suddenly become as rigorous as physics when you actually are dealing with human beings, which are much, much more complex than a binary answer?
Yes.
Right. So, why do you think that there are? I will take one example of, for instance, the anti-vaxxer movement. So, why do you think that they're not that they're not really afraid of dying? Because it seems to me that if you tell someone and give them the evidence that you're going to sort of die if you don't take the vaccines, then the cause of death anxiety because of the fear of death that is in everyone, they'll naturally say, okay, I'll take a chance. And, maybe I won't die. But it's not obvious to me because a lot of people don't do that, just not just in anti-vaccine, but also in religious cultures, people who willingly, risk their lives to save that of others. So do you think that this is just a way of like extending morality? Like if you're a soldier and you're dying for your country, you want to be remembered.
No, that's brilliant. We've written about this. We're silly. We're like, death can be hazardous to your health. And again, this gets back to this idea that we can be reasonable, but rarely are. And this is a predictable outcome from terror management theory, and that is that when push comes to shove, our allegiance to our cultural worldviews is more important psychodynamically. And then when existential anxieties are aroused, and we will respond in ways that fortify our commitment to those beliefs, even at the expense of our lives. And so in the United States, people who support President Trump are dying in record numbers because he represents a worldview where if you wear a mask, then you're a coward, or even worse, a Democrat, where vaccines better to ingest cow medicine than a vaccine, and social distancing is for fools. And so when people who support President Trump are reminded of their mortality, we would expect them to rip off their masks, lick the people next to them, and to resist even more medical advice. That's the same thing, by the way, that Christian fundamentalists do when they're reminded of death. They're less likely to go to the doctor and more likely to believe that God will take care of them. And so, yeah, it seems crazy, and it is crazy from a rational perspective, but this gets back to the point that that's not the default means by which the average person, myself included, makes it through the day. And yeah, I think, again, here we are, not to politicize this, but right now in the United States, we've got people dying, the world is burning, and the folks who support President Trump, they are opposed to everybody having insurance, and they're opposed to the government fixing the environment. And my point is like, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where you got, your biological needs and then these other ones. Well, I love Maslow, but he had it wrong. In America right now, it's more important to be white than it is to eat or have health care. And that's just a glaring in your face counterpoint to this idea that any amount of human misery is going to snap us out of our, kind of psychodynamic stupor to the point where we see things clearly.
Well, I agree with you with that broadly, and I do sort of have profound disagreements with the positive psychologists for multiple reasons. I've taken too much of your time. I'll just ask two more questions. So first, how do you think that one can consciously battle death anxiety? A person who is consciously afraid of dying and it's really affecting his or her life in a destructive, psychopathological manner. And second, how can a person take the death of someone close to them? You know, if someone close to you dies, how do you take them? And is there a way to die in a manner that those close to you will not be as hurt? You know, say someone who goes through a cancer, is there a way for that person to ensure that he or she dies in a manner that others around him actually are not as devastated as they would be otherwise?
Yeah, all great questions that I'm really uniquely unprepared to constructively address. I'm to be silly, but not. It's like, I've spent my life like studying death. And to be honest, in large measure, it was to avoid thinking about it myself. Now, this is nothing to be proud of, but a lot of our work, I think, is an intellectual dodging of these issues, because I've been disinclined to die since I was a child and realized that it was going to happen. So when you ask, how can we help someone who's really whose life is disrupted grotesquely by being riddled with death anxiety, I think this is where you need some kind of therapeutic assistance, and this is and that may vary across time and place. And I don't yet know. This is now what we're trying to think about more explicitly, because after 30 or 40 years of thinking about how concerns about death bring out the worst in us, now we're trying to think about, well, what are the palliative approaches? How can we take the edge off death in order to make life more amenable to productive enjoyment? And here we're just jumping into the age-old religious and philosophical traditions. So we're looking at things like gratitude and humility and mindfulness and cavorting with nature, all approaches. The philosophers, I think, who was Cicero, come to philosophize is to learn how to die. And so all cultures are directed at helping us throughout our life come to a mature understanding of death. Easier said than done. And I don't have an adequate answer to your very fine question about how one would go about doing that therapeutically. But your other question about, how can one die in a way that impacts those around us in a non-destructive fashion? Well, there I can only say that I don't know, but I what I do know is that people vary very much in terms of how they approach the end of their lives. And a guy named Erik Erikson, in his 8 stages of man, he talked about the last stage being ego integrity versus despair. And he's like, yeah, some people at the end of their lives are miserable. They're like, life has no meaning. I wish I could go back and be somebody else. And death is the ultimate turd in humanity's punch bowl. Other folks, as they get older, they're like, life has never been more meaningful. They say if they could live again, that they would want to be themselves, not that they wouldn't do things differently. And then they say, of course, I'm apprehensive about dying, but I see it as a perfectly reasonable price to pay for the privilege of having been alive in the first place. And both of my parents died 30 years ago, within 4 months of each other from cancer. And you know, I still miss them immensely, but I still remember vividly and am sustained psychodynamically on a day-to-day basis by the grace and humility that they exuded in those troubled times. And basically, they showed me by the way that they died very vividly how I hope to, I aspire to die in that fashion. And I hope that the way that I have lived in the wake of their passing has been influenced by the particular way that they did die.
Well, that is extremely profound and inspiring. What you're doing. I absolutely enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot from you. You've been one of my intellectual heroes. So it's been amazing talking with you. Did you enjoy the conversation?
Yep. No, just I want to say I feel the same way. This has been a pleasure. I look forward to exchanging ideas in the future. And I meant it when I said at the outset that I find your work admirable. And I saw something on Twitter today, which I never look at, but and tell me if I'm messing up here, but didn't you post at one point that you don't have all that many followers and that makes it hard to get some people to talk to you? Was there something along those lines someplace?
Yes, I did.
Well, yeah, my point is you deserve thousands and thousands of followers because of I think that you're an original thinker and you've got ambitious intent, and you're not interviewing people with an eye on just saying stuff that they might agree with. And this has been a pleasure. I don't care if 10 people listen to this. I thought this was an interesting conversation that produced some fine ideas. And who knows, if we get maybe one or two people to think differently as a result. It's been a great day. So thanks for having me. And I look forward to conversing again at some point.
My apologies. Actually, the power just went off suddenly. So
I see. I hope you guys are okay. We had the same thing earlier today. I was afraid that we were going to miss each other.
it's extremely kind of you to say. And you're right. Well, the reason I do this is to sit down and learn from people like you. It's an outlet of learning and exchanging ideas for me, not for gaining followers or anything. But so what I care about is these intellectual conversations because this is a learning experience for me, right? So it's extremely fascinating and it's an honor for me to sit down with people like you, and I cannot thank you enough for doing this.